Spetsgruppa, also known as Alpha Group or Alpha, whose official name is Directorate of the FSB Special Purpose Center, is an elite, standalone subunit of Russia's special forces. It is a dedicated counter-terrorism task force of the Russian Federal Security Service, which primarily prevents and responds to violent acts in public transportation and buildings. It was created by the Soviet KGB in 1974. Although little is known about the exact nature of its primary directives, it is speculated that the unit is authorized to act under the direct control and sanction of Russia's top political leadership, similar to its sister unit, the Directorate B, which is officially tasked with protecting Russia's strategic installations. It is also available for extended police duties, for paramilitary operations, and for covert operations, both domestically and internationally. In the Soviet Union, creation and organization. On the 28th of July 1974, Alpha Group was created on the orders of the KGB chairman, Yuri Andropov, in the aftermath of the 1972 Munich massacre. It might have been established as a response to West Germany's creation of the Grenzschutzgruppe 9, by attaching a special purpose unit to the office of the first chief directorate in Moscow. It was hoped that the Soviet Union's defensive capacity against terrorist attacks would increase significantly. At the time, other, more offensive special forces of the KGB included the groups Zenit and Cascade Omega. Another important mission for Alpha was to provide security for the Soviet leadership against enemy special forces in times of crisis or war. Later, territorial Alpha units were established across the Soviet Union, in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Two commanding officers of Group A were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, Gen. Viktor Karpukhin and Gen. Gennady Zaziev. Operations. Initially, this special-purpose counter-terrorism unit was involved in delicate operations which necessitated its members have a unique skill set. In 1979, the Alpha Group shot a young Soviet Ukrainian named Yuri Vlasenko, who was occupying a room in the consular section of the Embassy of the United States in Moscow, demanding he be granted asylum in the United States. He was either killed by gunfire or by the detonation of his homemade bomb, which also slightly damaged the building. Throughout the 1980s, Alpha became increasingly deployed domestically to respond to a rising number of hostage-taking situations, including at least 2 cases which involved buildings being taken over and hostages taken by violent groups of deserters from the Soviet Army, as well as other armed organizations. Notably, the 1983 hijacking of Aeroflot Flight 6833 into Mcleese, Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, was thwarted when Alpha stormed the airplane, killing 3 and capturing 3 other hijackers who were attempting to escape to the west, which also resulted in the loss of 5 hostages. The unit also became involved in the ethnic conflicts throughout the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Alpha was also used as the spearhead of KGB counterintelligence operations, interdicting hostile intelligence operations on Soviet territory and seizing enemy spies such as CIA agent Adolf Tolkachev in 1985. Foreign operations. Soon, Alpha was assigned missions far exceeding its formal scope. On the 27th of December 1979, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev launched a surprise armed intervention and regime change operation in the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Soviet forces, including KGB commandos who had infiltrated the country on a pretense to guard the Soviet embassy, were able to quickly secure important government institutions throughout Kabul. Those institutions included the Ministry of the Interior, the headquarters of the KHAD Security Service, the Ministry of Defense, and the Tajbeg Palace, which, during a 34-minute storming, they successfully assassinated President Hafizullah Amin, along with his mistress and his young son. The assault on Tajbeg Palace was given the name Operation Storm 333 and involved a combined force of Soviet airborne paratroopers and special forces groups from the GRU and the KGB, including 24 men from the Thunder detachment of Alfa Group. The Alfa detachment were dressed in Afghan uniforms and headed by Grigory Boyranov, commandant of the Special Operations School of the KGB's Department.It. It was Boyranov who ordered that all Afghan witnesses of the operation be killed, and he was accidentally shot dead by Alfa troops when he was mistaken for a palace guard. According to Russian sources, the members of this highly trained group performed remarkably well, losing only 2 men, the lightest casualties of any of the forces involved in the raid. However, the success of Storm 333 and the initial invasion marked the beginning of the 10-year Soviet war in Afghanistan, and subsequently, Alfa Group's extensive involvement throughout the conflict. 6 years later, in October 1985, Alfa Group was dispatched to war-torn Beirut, Lebanon. The Kremlin was informed of the kidnapping of 4 Soviet diplomats by the militant group the Islamic Liberation Organization. It was believed that this was retaliation for the Soviet support of Syrian involvement in the Lebanese civil war. However, by the time Alfa arrived, one of the hostages had already been killed. Through a network of supporting KGB operatives, members of the task force identified each of the perpetrators involved in the crisis, and once identified, began to take the relatives of these militants as hostages. Following the standard Soviet policy of no negotiations with terrorists, one of the hostages taken by Alfa Group had his testicles removed and sent to the militants before being killed. The warning was clear: more would follow unless the remaining hostages were released immediately. The show of force worked, and for a period of 20 years no Soviet or Russian officials were taken captive, until the 2006 abduction and murder of 4 Russian embassy staff in Iraq. However, the veracity of this story has been brought into question. Another version says that the release of the Soviet hostages was the result of extensive diplomatic negotiations with the spiritual leader of Hezbollah, Grand Ayatollah Mohammad Hussein Fadlallah, who appealed to King Hussein of Jordan and the leaders of Libya and Iran to use their influence on the kidnappers. Fall of the Soviet Union intervention in the Baltics. On the 11th of March 1990, the Supreme Council of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic made public their intent to secede from the Soviet Union and re-establish the independent Republic of Lithuania. As a result of this pronouncement, on the 9th of January 1991, the Soviet leadership dispatched Alfa Group to quell the independence movement and maintain Lithuania's status as a Soviet republic. This attempt to re-establish Soviet dominance culminated in the violent seizure of the Vilnius TV tower on the 13th of January 1991, during which the Soviet forces killed 13 unarmed Lithuanian protesters, as well as 1 Alfa operative. In 2011, the former commander of Alfa Group, retired KGB Col. Mikhail Golovatov, was detained at Vienna International Airport on an European arrest warrant due to this incident, issued by Lithuania, but Austrian authorities released him within 24 hours, claiming that the information provided by Lithuania Lithuania was too vague. In response, the Lithuanian parliament discussed breaking diplomatic ties with Austria in protest. A joint statement by the foreign ministers of all three Baltic states condemned Golovatov's release, and said that it should have been one of the occasions when suspects are detained and extradited, particularly when they are accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, as the crimes performed in 1991 in Vilnius and Riga have no limitation. 1991 Soviet Coup d'Acute attempt. During the events of the Soviet coup attempt in August 1991, Alfa Group's commanding officer, Gen. Karpukhin, was commanded by KGB chairman Vladimir Khrushchev to forcibly enter the White House, Russia's acting parliament, after paratroopers secured the entrance, to eliminate the president of the Russian SFSR Boris Yeltsin, and various other anti-coup leaders assembled there. In addition to Alfa Group, Gen. Karpukhin was also given authority of Vega Group, elements of the Soviet airborne internal troops, special units of the Dzerzhinsky Division, mobilized units of the Moscow OMON, 3 tank companies, and a squadron of helicopters. On-site analysis of the area was conducted by Airborne Deputy Commander Alexander Lebed, and other senior officers who mingled with the crowds of anti-coup protesters nearest to the White House. There was a general consensus among the military officials who gathered that day, as evidenced by the statements months after the botched coup attempt, that had they followed through on their endeavor it would have succeeded. The stated mission objectives could have been reached in no more than half an hour, but it would have come at a terrible human cost. Shortly after their assessment was made, Gen. Karpukhin and Vimpel's Boris Bestov convinced the KGB deputy chairman, Gennady Agiev, that such a massive undertaking should be cancelled. In the Russian Federation, decorated servicemen, as of 2013, 8 officers of Alfa have been awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation. LT Gennady Sergeyev, Colonel Anatoly Savaliev, Maj Vladimir Ulyanov, Maj Yuri Danilin, Colonel Sergei Dyachenko, Colonel Valery Kanakin, Maj Alexander Perov, Colonel Andrei Kum. Shufflings and reforms. Alfa Group was severely downgraded during the dissolution and collapse of the Soviet Union. After the fall of the USSR, both Alfa and Vimpel were transferred to the newly formed Main Guard Directorate, which was established on the basis of the KGB's 9th Chief Directorate. In 1993, they were taken from GWO control, and for a time being put under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, as part of the government shake-up following the June 1995 Budyonnovsk hospital hostage crisis, in which the Alfa Group had a leading role. Yeltsin fired the first director of the Federal Security Service, Sergei Stepashin. 2 months later, Alfa and Vitiaz were both transferred from the MVD to the FSB. Simultaneously, Mikhail Baskov became the new head of the organization and created the FSB Anti-Terrorist Center, headed by Gen. Viktor Zorin. Directorate-A was tasked with protecting transportation and buildings, while Directorate-B was tasked with protecting strategic sites. A and B were soon joined in a TSENTR Spetsnaz under Gen. Vladimir Pranichev. Meanwhile, Alfa veterans became active in legitimate businesses, in organized crime, as well as in politics. The Alfa Veterans Association, led by Sergei Goncharov, strongly opposed Russian President Yeltsin faction's party, Our Home, Russia. In the legislative election of 1995, Gen. Karpukhin, who resigned from the service following the 1991 coup attempt, became Chief of Security security to Kazakh President Nursultan Nazarbayev, after which he worked with private security companies in Moscow, and ran unsuccessfully for the Duma as a member of the Union of Patriots in 1995. Operations. In October 1995, Alfa killed the armed man who hijacked a bus with South Korean tourists in Moscow, who had demanded $1 million and to be flown out of the country. In December 1997, Alfa freed the Swedish trade councillor Jan-Olof Nyström, who was kidnapped in Moscow by a gunman similarly demanding a ransom and a flight out of Russia. The hostage was swapped for Alfa's Colonel Anatoly Savelyev, and the hostage-taker was killed during the storming of the embassy. Colonel Savelyev was injured during the action, and died in hospital of a heart attack shortly thereafter. 1993 Russian constitutional crisis. In 1993, during the Russian constitutional crisis, Yeltsin, who by then was president of the Russian Federation, used Alfa and Vimpel during a deadly showdown in central Moscow against the pro-parliament forces that sided with Vice President Alexander Rutskoy. The pro-parliament faction had seized the Russian White House, along with several Supreme Soviet deputies who had been taken hostage. Yeltsin ordered Russian troops to storm the building, including elements of the paratroopers, the Alfa and Vimpel groups, Russian ground forces, and the internal troops' Special Forces Unit (VTAS). However, the Alfa troops initially refused to attack the White House, reportedly bringing the commander, Gen. Zayevyev, to the brink of suicide over the open insubordination of his troops in the face of a presidential order. When one of the Alfa troops, Lt. Sergeyev, who was near the White House, was mortally wounded by sniper fire from the nearby Hotel Ukraine, the unit finally agreed to move. Opposition gunmen were blamed for the shooting, but it is possible that the shots were actually fired by members of a special unit loyal to Yeltsin. It was rumored that the snipers in the hotel were commanded by Alexander Korsakov, chief of the Presidential Security Service. The crisis ended when Yeltsin's forces, paratroopers supported by tanks and armored personnel carriers, many of which were manned not by conscripts but members of the Union of Afghanistan veterans, stormed and seized the White House on the 4th of October 1993, killing dozens and possibly hundreds of people and ensuring the total victory of Yeltsin's faction. In the end, Rutskoy and the other leaders of anti-Yeltsin faction, including Ruslan Khasbulatov, Vladislav Akolov and Viktor Barannikov, all negotiated the surrender to the Alfa troops, who had entered the shelled and burning building after the shooting stopped, and brought them, along with the detained Supreme Soviet deputies, to Lefortovo prison. Conflicts in Chechnya and the North Caucasus. The Alfa group was involved in the First Chechen War of 1994 to 1996. Following the Chechens' declaration of independence from the Russian SFSR and then the Soviet Union in 1991. In the fall of 1994, Alfa provided personal security details for the main commanders of the invasion of Chechnya, Defense Minister Pavel Grachev and Federal Interior Minister Viktor Yerin, as they traveled to the Mozdok Air Base in North Ossetia, which was the main headquarters, staging area and logistics base for Russian forces entering Chechnya. Later, many Alfa troops served in mobile anti-terror groups, as well as providing security for the pro-Moscow Chechen government complex and the regional FSB headquarters in the Chechen capital Grozny. In August 1996, when the city was retaken by Chechen separatist forces, 35 of them took part in a defense of the FSB headquarters. The separatist forces began to systematically retake individual buildings which were being defended by cut-off groups of Russian military military and security forces. By the war's final ceasefire, the main FSB office was one of the few key structures still being held by federal forces in central Grozny, but at the cost of 70 of its defenders lives in some of the fiercest fighting during the last battle. Allegations arose, following the Kashviut Accord of August 1996, that the ATC carried out clandestine operations intended to discredit the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, so that it would not receive international recognition of its independence. According to Jonathan Little, the service was most likely deeply involved in many of the high-profile kidnappings which damaged Chechnya's reputation. Little wrote, "It is impossible to say whether these provocations were part of a more general FSB policy or whether the and its departments were running their own show. Certainly it did not reflect the official policy of the government, nor of those officials like Ivan Rybkin, the Secretary of the Security Council, tasked with the Chechen dossier between 1996 and 1999. Alfa was active during the Second Chechen War that began in 1999, as well as the subsequent insurgency in the North Caucasus. During the 2000 Battle of Komsomolskoye, Alfa snipers attached to Vladimir Shamanov's Western Group of Federal Forces were deployed in an attempt to suppress Ruslan Gelayev's snipers in the village. According to the unit's veterans, operations in which Alfa took part led to the arrest of Chechen commander Salman Raduyev in 2000, the killing of Chechen commander Abi Barayev in 2001, the killing of Chechen separatist President Aslan Maskhadov in 2005, and the killing of foreign militant leader Abu Hafs in Dagestan in 2006. Following the transfer of responsibility for operations in Chechnya from the Ministry of Defense to the FSB in January 2001, and prior to the Chechenization policy that began in 2003, Alfa members participated in at least 10 mixed combined special groups, considered death squads by human rights groups and outside observers. It is believed that the SSGs were behind many of the numerous name, address cleansings, usually nighttime raids by masked men in unmarked vehicles, targeting specific active or former rebel combatants, the supporters, the relatives, or other civilians for either forced disappearance or outright extrajudicial killing. In 2005, Human Rights Watch declared that the disappearances had reached the scale of a crime against humanity, and that Russia has the inglorious distinction of being a world leader in enforced disappearances. Chechnya's UFSB also formed a local Alfa unit believed to be similar in its role to the SSG's mass hostage crises. The group was instrumental in the Russian government's attempts to forcibly bring an end to a series of mass hostage crisis incidents, in which groups of Chechen and other separatist militants took hostages. These events took place in Russia's southern territories near Chechnya as well as in the Russian heartland, and were made up of the Budyonnovsk hospital hostage crisis in June 1995, the Kislyar-Pervomayskoye hostage crisis in January 1996, the Moscow theater hostage crisis in October 2002, and the Beslan school hostage crisis in September 2004. Each of these high-profile incidents resulted in hundreds of fatalities and injuries among the hostages and, with the exception of the Moscow siege, significant losses among the unit's personnel. At Budyonnovsk in Stavropol Krai, two abortive storming attempts by Alfa and Vimpel killed scores of hostages in a major public relations disaster for the Russian government, as the carnage was televised live across the country. In the first pre-dawn raid, only 86 out of more than 1,500 hostages were freed, but more than 30 hostages were killed before the rescuers were forced to retreat after 4 hours of fighting. which also resulted in the deaths of several men on both sides. After that, the leader of the hostage-takers, Chechen commander Shamal Bashayev, agreed to release pregnant and nursing women, and to allow emergency services to put out a fire in the main building and to collect and remove dead bodies. The assault was then resumed at noon and included the use of tear gas. It stopped after over an hour later when Bashayev agreed to release the remaining women and children. The overall death toll of more than 120 people included 3 Alfa members. In the end, the crisis was resolved through negotiations that led to an agreement involving a ceasefire in Chechnya and high-level peace talks, both of which later broke down, with full-scale hostilities resuming in October 1995. Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin claimed that both attacks had not been authorized by the government, but were launched by troops acting without orders. At Pervomayskoye, a small settlement on the outskirts of Kizlyar in Dagestan, in an operation that was conducted under the direct control of Baskov, Alfa Group was mostly held in reserve during multiple failed storming attempts spearheaded by Vityaz and the SOBR, supported by tanks and armored vehicles. Further attacks were conducted with heavy artillery, including Grad launches firing salvos of rockets into the village, and helicopter gunship support. According to statements made to justify the use of unlimited force, the FSB had been informed, falsely, that the hostages had been executed by the captors prior to the commencement of military operations. This full-scale offensive continued for 3 days, until the Chechen militants fought their way through the siege lines in a nighttime breakout, escaping with many of the surviving hostages in another major humiliation for the Kremlin. 26 out of the 150 hostages lost their lives, and in all the incident resulted more than 300 fatalities, mostly among the Russian forces, although they avoided the kind of devastating losses that decimated the Moscow SOBR and the 22nd Independent Brigade of Spetsnaz GRU. Alfa Group still suffered casualties at Pervomayskoye. These included a friendly fire incident which occurred after fighting had ended, when a regular soldier accidentally fired his vehicle's Grom gun, killing 2 Alfa members. When the Alfa Group was deployed, they were sent in without winter clothing and quartered in unheated buses. One of the unit's commanders claimed they were set up, saying, "The first day it was 15 below and we were standing in the fields with no warm clothes. There were no sleeping bags, no water, no food. The hostages were being destroyed, the rebels were being destroyed, and we were being destroyed there. That's what happened." Several highly controversial actions made the force susceptible to criticism revolving around the loss of life among the hostages. One of these actions was the use of an unknown chemical agent to assist Alfa Group and the SOBR break the October 2002 Moscow hostage crisis, by knocking out the people inside the building. The FSB chemical attack resulted in the deaths of at least 129 hostages and serious damage to the health of many others, yet was hailed by the group's officers as their first successful operation for years. In 2011, the European Court of Human Rights ordered Russia to pay compensation to 64 survivors of the siege for the physical and emotional suffering, and to prosecute the officials who committed the human rights violations, ruling that the authorities had failed to minimize the risks to the hostages. Russia failed to uphold the ECHR ruling, paying the compensation to victims but not launching an investigation into the violations. Another controversy was the use of tank cannons, portable flamethrowers, and other weapons such as grenade launchers in Beslan, North Ossetia. On the 3rd of September 2004, the local school was taken
over by Chechen-led militants from Ingushetia, and was subsequently raided by the heavily armed FSB Special Forces of Alfa and Wimpel. The operation was overseen by the head of the Special Purpose Center, Gen. Alexander Tikhonov, who forbade extinguishing the fire in the school, while the actual attack was personally led by Gen. Kronichev, and supported by tanks, armored personnel carriers and attack helicopters. John Mcleese, a member of the Special Air Service team which had liberated the Iranian embassy in London in 1980, immediately called it one of the worst hostage rescue attempts he had seen or heard about. The Beslan siege turned out to be particularly bloody, costing the lives of more than 330 hostages, as well as at least 7 Alfa members. According to the government, the burn impact was post-mortem, and thus there were no grounds for a criminal case against troops who used flamethrowers during the assault. No ballistic tests were carried out, and prosecutors were not allowed to examine the special forces' weapons to determine who exactly killed the hostages. In 2007, 447 survivors and relatives of victims of the Beslan massacre brought complaint against the Russian government in 7 applications to the ECHR.